Okay, welcome everybody to the July 20th edition of Going Viral at GoingViral.news. My name is Jim Dingman. I'm joined on the air with Ken Aaron in California, Dennis Goldstein in the metropolitan area out in New Jersey, and myself. So let's just look at some of the headlines. It's a wide variety of headlines to be examined today. I'm now showing folks The Guardian. The Guardian is basically unveiling Biden's plan to deal with the issue of this sudden dramatic heat that the whole world is experiencing. And he unveils a plan, but he does not declare climate emergency. And right here you'll see on this page here, they're talking about how in Europe, London firefighters are seeing the busiest day they've had since the Second World War because they are not used to this extreme heat. I understand it's reached 137 degrees in certain parts of Europe. And one of the problems they're having is that the infrastructure is not designed to sustain that kind of heat. So in the case of London, they are seeing the railroad tracks twist out of shape. They're seeing fires break out along the railroad lines. And we don't have to mention, of course, the forest fires that they're facing throughout Europe, Portugal, Spain, France, etc. So here we have this incredible situation going on. And here is a story: fastest growing U.S. cities become unlivable, or could become unlivable. Let's see what they have to say. They're talking about cities such as San Antonio, Phoenix, Arizona. I've lived in Phoenix, Arizona, and I've been there when it's 110 degrees. So it is quite remarkable. And they're talking about what could happen if you have a whole bunch of cities, particularly in the Sun Belt, which we know has enjoyed tremendous explosions of population industry in the past 60 to 70 years. If you have these kind of attacks of heat that not only make it uninhabitable for people, but destroy crops and other critical issues of infrastructure. And in terms of Europe, in terms of the United States, some people I know on this phone call live in California. Ken does. And California, of course, has been clobbered by this situation for several decades now. But anyway, we'll spend some time. We'll pay something in a few minutes that has to do with that. We have this question of the text that's going on in terms of the issue of the Secret Service. The Secret Service magically lost all the text messages that had to do with Mr. Trump on January 4th, 5th, and 6th. And that's causing a big furor in the investigation of the January 6th incidents. They're basically surprised that the Secret Service has erased all this, and we'll see what happens as time goes on. And then let's look here. You had Ivana Trump's funeral. Donald Trump gave her a send-off. And then you have the news here, which we can go back into later, the war in Ukraine. The First Lady of Ukraine is pleading for the U.S. for more weapons. The Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said today they may occupy more territory, etc., etc. So that's some of the headlines in The Guardian. Let me just look quickly at the Washington Post to just share what the headlines are there. This is the Washington Post today. They're talking about, now here, look at this. We're going to have a hearing tomorrow with, I believe, the White House counsel. And now, surprise, surprise, even a day after January 6th, Trump balked at condemning the violence. And they're talking about, of course, the persistence of the whole issue of the mythology of the election was stolen. You have the prosecution of Steve Bannon. The prosecution rests in his contempt of appearing up on Capitol Hill. And then you have this issue of
I'm going to mute you, Jim. I have to mute you because there's two things coming through.
Yeah, okay. What happened? Okay, it doesn't matter. Anyway, okay, okay. Ken? Are we all right?
Oh, I know what it is. Okay. It was the YouTube thing. Let me just turn off the sound.
Oh, all right. I didn't put any YouTube stuff on, but anyway. All right. And then you have this issue of same-sex marriage. We know that they're talking about that. There is, of course, it's interesting, the Marine Corps has promoted a 4-star African-American general to be that's the first time an African-American general has reached that rank in the Marine Corps. And a bill to prevent Trump's attempted coup is finally ready and must pass. So let's just the editorial of the Washington Post. I remember when I was, everybody was trumpeting about what happened in November of 2020, and it was pretty clear to me that he was planning a coup d'etat. Didn't take a brain surgeon to figure that out. But here we have a editorial in the Washington Post talking about essentially introducing a bipartisan proposal to reform the Electoral Count Act, which is an act that was created in the late 19th century that they were going to use as their way to basically eliminate the legitimacy of the election. And so those are some of the headlines today. Now let me first start with a piece from the BBC. This is on the whole question of the global warming in Europe. This was played earlier today, and this is the BBC talking about this terrible phenomena going on in Europe of this heat wave. Let me just make sure I get the sound right, because it sometimes is a problem. There we go. Let me just get the computer sound, and there it should be.
Wildfires are burning in different parts of the continent, including in France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Croatia and Greece. They're also burning in Morocco, in North Africa. In France, the authorities are warning of a heat apocalypse. We know many towns and cities have recorded their highest ever temperatures. The city of Nantes recorded 42 degrees Celsius, beating a previous high of 40.3 degrees set more than 70 years ago. And the town of Saint-Brieuc on the north coast reached 39.5 degrees Celsius. The previous record was 38.1, dating back to 1949. Well, this was the scene overnight in the Gironde region on the French Atlantic coast. You can see the scale of the fires that are burning through some of the forest there. Then this is drone footage from earlier, again, showing us the scale of what's happening. And this is the satellite image that shows the region. You can see smoke is clearly visible from space. We know thousands of firefighters are now battling these fires, and more than 14,000 hectares of forest have already been damaged. As well as that, over 20,000 people have been evacuated, and that figure is expected to rise. Let's hear from one of them.
It was very smoky this morning. It's very bad for the lungs. I knew there were problems coming, so I prepared a grab bag. Even the medications for my dogs were ready to go.
Well, this is the National Director of Fire and Rescue Services in France.
We need a lot of water to extinguish pines that, for example, in the area of Bordeaux are more than 30 meters high. So it's very difficult even just for one tree, and you cannot put one fire truck for one tree. It's impossible.
Well, next let's hear from our Europe correspondent, Jessica Parker, who's in southwest France.
Hi, it's Congressman Jamie Raskin. Forgive me for being so direct, but it's important. Will you rush $22 right now to help?
There has been obviously temperatures soaring today, peaking over 40 degrees here while these wildfires continue. That, by the way, is a local evacuation centre. And we were here a couple of days ago when the air was clear. But today you can smell, you can taste the smoke as those wildfires continue to rage. The winds around here have been described as unstable and the fire spreading. We've just heard in the last hour that a further 5,000 people are set to be evacuated from the local area. Some of them will be coming straight here. And what the authorities are saying, it's because of the smoke, not because those villages or towns are at threat of the fire itself, but it's the smoke and the health risks around that. Further inland, another blaze in the area of Landiras. There are further evacuations there as well.
That's Jessica in southwest France. Next, let's turn to neighbouring Spain, because wildfires there have been burning in the hills of Mijas near the city of Malaga, which is in the southwest. Firefighters have managed to get those under control, but you can see the extent of the damage from this satellite image. The area is close to beach resorts on the Costa del Sol, and our correspondent Bethany Bell is there.
The fire swept down this hillside, and you can see the destruction that's been left behind. There's still a strong smell of burnt wood in the air, and ash is flying around. The authorities have managed to control the fires that were burning in this region near Mijas, just outside of Malaga. And the people who were evacuated from their homes have now been able to return.
Let's switch from the southwest of Spain to the northwest, where officials in the Zamora province say 20 wildfires are burning out of control and threatening houses and threatening people's livelihoods. This is footage posted on social media from inside a train in the Zamora province. You can see wildfires burning on both sides of the train. Well, here's a resident describing the situation there.
People are really angry, but they are also very, very scared for their lives. And not only because of the fire that is going now, but because everything is destroyed, animals and the harvest. The fire is really bad right now, but the winter is going to be really, really hard. A lot of people won't have anything to eat. And it's just very, very, very sad to see that.
And on the situation in Spain, let's hear once more from our correspondent, Bethany Bell.
In the northwestern area of Zamora, 2 people are known to have died. One was a fireman who died last night, and Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez said on Twitter that he extended his condolences to the family, and he also thanked everybody who was fighting the fires in these difficult conditions. The second death was a shepherd who died, and apparently because he had ignored warnings to go out into the burnt areas, and his body has now been found.
We've heard from Spain, we've heard from France. Next we turn to Portugal, where temperatures have dropped over the weekend, but more than 1,000 firefighters are still battling 9 fires in the central and northern regions. Let's speak to Alison Roberts, who's live with us from Lisbon. Alison, first of all, bring us right up to date on those fires and their scale, please.
Yes, as you say, temperatures have dropped, but most of Portugal is still under extreme and very high fire risk. 6 fires currently are of most concern. And we're just getting reports, I'm sorry to say, of 2 people who have died while trying to flee the flames. That was in Villarreal district in the north of Portugal. According to local reports, it was an elderly couple who were scared because of the flames and started to try to flee, and they went off the road. So that's all the details we have, not confirmed as yet, but that's what we're hearing from local reports, speaking to local police there. And other fires are burning in other places, some of them quite close to major towns. Guarda, which is one of the big towns in the interior, in the north there, that's residential areas and industrial areas are being surrounded by flames, according to local reports.
And Alison, how do these fires compare with what Portugal might experience in a normal or average summer?
Well, so far this year, 43,000 hectares have burned, and of that, something like 28,000 has been just in the last week and a half. So already this year, we've seen more burn than any year since 2017. You may remember 2017 was the year that we had those terrible fires in June when 66 people died. And of course, that's a memory that people still carry with them, a trauma, and people are constantly referring back to that situation and seeing whether communication has improved, coordination has improved. It certainly has seemed to, and there seems to be more successful prevention than in the past, but we'll have to see whether firefighters can continue to keep most of these blazes under control.
You were mentioning there's been some respite in the temperatures over the weekend, but what's the forecast going into this week? Will the respite continue as those fires are being battled?
Yes, they're going to stay below 40 degrees, it seems, but they may go up a little towards Thursday and Friday. And in terms of the fire risk, more of the country will be at extreme fire risk at that time in the week. So things are going to worsen a little as the week wears on, I'm afraid.
Alison, thank you very much indeed. We switch from Portugal to North Africa because Morocco has also been seeing temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. This comes as the country is facing the worst drought recorded in the last 30 years. Many of the wildfires have largely been contained, but there are still some that are not under control. Here's Usama Amari, a journalist at Morocco World News.
More than 6,000 hectares of forest land have been damaged by the fires. But while there are still fires being fought in the northern region of Morocco, they do say that a few of them have been contained. The largest one, which has damaged over 5,000 hectares, is still being fought, although it is contained to a large degree, up to 70% according to the official numbers. But these fires have been proven very difficult to combat. The terrain where they are happening is very difficult to traverse, and for firefighting planes, there isn't any nearby large enough water sources to use to bring water to the fires to fight them.
Now, scientists are warning that these heat waves are going to become more regular as climate change continues. Let's hear from our climate correspondent, Jonah Fisher.
This isn't a one-off, a freak weather event. It's something that we're going to have to get used to. For as long as our emissions continue to warm the planet, and at the moment temperatures are rising by 1/4 degree every 10 years, heat waves like this one are going to become more frequent and more intense.
Now, some leaders have been explicitly connecting this heat wave with climate change. For example, here's Prime Minister Sanchez in Spain.
More than 70,000 hectares have been destroyed as a result of fires so far this year in our country. That's almost double the average of the last decade. All these fires are caused by heat waves due to the climatic emergency that the planet is experiencing right now.
That's in Spain. The UK is also experiencing a heat wave, and Prince Charles has reminded the public that these record-breaking temperatures show that those commitments around net zero have never been more vitally important. But experts are worried that perhaps not enough is being done.
We have 3 years from now, a little bit less now, but 3 years to take decisions to go into the direction of a livable world. So we can still act to make it livable for human beings on this planet. It's just on us to decide.
All right. So that's what's going on in Europe. So let's start. Ken, now you're the one who lives in California. Anyway, so Kenny, what's your reaction to this?
Well, every time I hear that, and in that report also, they made a statement. It was a few degrees higher. It's a record breaker because it's a few degrees higher than the last time it reached 108 degrees, or whenever, 1945 or 1911. So, you know, decades and decades ago, there had been high temperatures near this, you know, but they went 1/2 degree higher. So it's not, you know, it's not due to the progression of global warming that they're talking about. It's an incident that occurred, and it hasn't happened in 50 years, or it hadn't happened in 100 years. Well, it did happen 100 years ago or 50 years ago. It should be, if it's just a progression in the heat accumulating, it just should be getting hotter and hotter and hotter every year for longer and longer periods. But so I believe there's climate change, of course. I personally think it's mostly due to the physics of how the Earth moves around the sun and different perihedron, different things, the angle of axis and moving of the North Pole. There's a lot of factors involved in temperature, and also has to do with solar flares and so forth. I think there's major effects, much more significant than the human addition of CO2, which obviously acts to some degree. But I've seen reports which indicate the effects of adding CO2 are plateauing. In other words, it's already happened. If you double the CO2, it wouldn't make much more of a difference anymore because we're already up there. But I just consider it as a cheap shot, saying, climate change, it's hot today. And you look up the reports in this, it's got to do with a high pressure weather, abnormal high pressure weather system. And they describe it. It's like what a meteorologist would say. The cause of the heat waves, an abnormal high pressure system sitting over Europe. And then a sandstorm which came up from Algeria, and some hot weather, this, that, and the other thing, which happens sometimes. And, you know, when they had a thing here called, they give it a name, El Nino, you know, just oddball phenomena that's going to happen in a complex weather system that we live in. It isn't as orderly and predictable as people would like it to be. You know, it's sort of like, that makes people more comfortable if they can, whether it's good or bad, if you can predict. You eat too much you're going to gain weight. You know, you smoke cigarettes, you're going to get cancer, and so forth. And it's predictable. But life's not that predictable, and certainly all of the elements of an ecosystem, like the planet and the weather, there's going to be lots of things that are going to affect everything. And the answers are not that simple.
Ken makes me very afraid, and I'm probably not going to go out for the rest of the week. I would suggest that the science, the approved science, suggests something different than what Ken is suggesting here. In that, with the increase of carbon and methane in the atmosphere, every year, as Ken stated, the yearly temperature has risen. In that context, the planet's going to be fine. The people on the planet aren't going to be fine. And it's because we fail to understand or fail to even be exposed to simple information, which I can only sort of sketch out from the top of my head, unable to be explicit. However, if you fail to understand the jet stream, if you fail to understand the Gulf Stream, if you fail to understand what additional heat in the atmosphere does to the oceans, if you fail to understand a number of things I am even unaware of, the conclusion you would come to is that folks who know would say that although it's complicated, we can change this. I noticed that in the explanation, as they're having the fires, and we're only talking about 100 degrees here. What happens when it pops up to 115, 120 on a regular basis? The comparison to what happened 10 years ago and what's happening now, the regularity of the fires, the frequency of the high heat, I think is something that we need to be really concerned about, especially in the context that the economies are all linked to poisoning us, whether it be carbon, whether it be plastic, whether it be chemicals. We need to use the science to change how we're living. If we fail to do that, then you're looking at transhumanism simply to survive on the planet.
All right, thank you. Dennis, your comments. Dennis Goldstein, we're very curious to hear what you have to say about the latest developments in global climate change.
I agree with, do you hear me now?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay, I agree with Darryl. I would add that we should think of global warming as an emergency, planetary emergency, and I would say that we should make carbon emissions illegal. That burning fossil fuels should be illegal. I would say that as quickly as possible, and I'll leave it at that.
All right. Thank you, Dennis. Let's hear what Frank has to say. Frank?
Yeah, not an expert. You know, back in the Industrial Revolution in London, you could walk outside and basically get consumption almost immediately because it was coal-fired and it wasn't smokeless coal. So, you had those pea supers and it was lethal. But, there's a price to pay for progress. And unfortunately, there's got to be progress in India and there's got to be progress in China. And you can't really get away from that. Now, they're aware of fossil fuels being, as far as carbon emissions, but there's competition. You can't just sit down on your hands and allow that race to go against you because, that's one of the power factors in who's going to be the hegemonic power next, So you have to deal with it. Now, as far as the heat index is going up, I I have to agree with old Al Gore. I remember watching one of his dire, I think it was a video of some kind, but anyway, way back in the 90s, where he was talking about carbon emissions going through the roof. Well, that was then, so presumably he's right. Yeah, and I can't but remember the quote from Shatner when he went up on Bezos's little trip to space. He landed back down and he said, "I saw death," which wasn't a great advertisement for Bezos, but I saw death. You know, it's only, which is true. It's only a thin veneer, the whole, of atmosphere that we've got. And so what concerns me is, if you recall from 9/11, it was said that there were 4,000 jet planes up in the air at that time. So that's probably not unusual. How many jet planes are up there? I mean, they suck oxygen. Forget about it. They don't replace it with anything other than the worst kind of emissions. So, there are jet fleets, especially in growing, populations like China, that will also be sucking out that thin veneer of atmosphere. So I don't know. From the point of view of people who are our age, it's like, well, hey, we're going to have some hot summers. But, I've been in heat before. Don't particularly mind it, to tell you the truth. But 2 generations from now, they're gonna be perhaps finding it very difficult to get a decent, lung full of decent air. That's I don't know how to alleviate that. As far as droughts in Africa, well, that's going to go through the roof, and probably in Bangladesh and places like that too. Yeah, well, maybe not Bangladesh, but well, you name it. When there's a rapid climate change, massive droughts, massive starvation, massive turmoil. Yeah, that's going to happen. Then you've got these tsunami of problems coming down the pike in terms of growth of population. Now, there doesn't seem to be a world organization to deal with it in any logical way, especially as you've got hegemonic powers being what they are. And also, it surprises me when you're looking at these forest fires, how seemingly inept the fire brigades are. It's like, that's the best you can do. You can't use thermobaric bombs to blow away these fires. I don't know. There must be ways. Freon gas, who knows? But the way they're doing it, you see these guys with little sprinklers. What are you doing? And then they're engulfed by flames next minute. There's an incompetence there which is striking. I think somebody needs to sit down with them and say, look, we'll give you $1 billion. Now get your act together in a hurry. Same with, these aircraft that are dropping. I don't know what they're dropping. They seem to be totally ineffective. They say, well, it's contained. I mean, it's a job for a part-time fireman, I guess, but doesn't seem to be right. Doesn't seem to be well orchestrated. And I think in Germany, they have manicured forests. So there's distances between trees. So I suspect that no matter how dry it gets, they can control it. So that may be another suggestion. We've got to have trees to replace the oxygen that we're sucking up so quick. But yeah, so don't know what the answer is, but yeah, green parties, they're on the political horizon everywhere. Greta Thunberg, very nice young lady, I guess. But you've got to be practical too. You've got to get with the reality of the world situation if you're going to address this. And that's about it.
All right, thank you, Frank. Let's hear from Michael Jankowitz. Go on, Mike.
Well, I don't know if you discussed any of this at the beginning of the discussion, But obviously, this is an interrelated thing. I think we've got about 7 years left before we hit what's known as the point of no return. And the point of no return, it's not going to be like when worlds collide, all of a sudden the planet will blow up. It means that at that point, we will not be able to reverse the process of global warming and environmental, actually, catastrophe with the technology that exists at the present time. So in other words, at that point, it will continue to get worse. We will be constantly playing catch up and never catching up. We have a situation, I mean, when I say this is interrelated, we have a situation where very soon, I mean, we're not talking about in generations, but at most in decades, I think the amount was about 20% of the world that is now habitable will be inhabitable. And people talk about, oh, we've got to stop this illegal immigration. Well, you're not going to be able to stop any immigration if 20% of the world is going to have to go elsewhere to the more habitable areas. Not only that, I mean, you know, it is all interrelated. What's happening in the oceans, if the algae starts dying off, the food chain, arable land, there'll be less arable land, therefore there'll be less food. We're heading for, in other words, we're heading for a catastrophe, of course, but in real time, it's going to get worse. And we've seen this, obviously, with the rise in temperature, talking about places becoming inhabitable. As far as the wildfires go, I have to tell you something. I know many people who have been involved in those wildfires, and wildfires spread extraordinarily rapidly, possibly beyond our capacity right now to contain them. We've managed to contain them in many ways, but actually we've contained them with the help of nature. I don't think we have the capacity to contain the spread of these wildfires without nature's help. I mean, this is a situation where it's the equivalent of a world war. In other words, we have to gear up for it the way we would for a major world war, the way we did for World War II, and we're not doing it. The same thing happened during COVID. People said, well, you know, I'm not going to inconvenience myself or something, or we worry about the economy. Of course, we have to worry about the economy, but there'll be no economy if there's no environment. When we hear about things like the Supreme Court ruling, which limited our ability to limit carbon emissions, with Joe Manchin defending his investments in coal or something. These are people who are pursuing their own aims, and you can say all politics is local, but in this case, local isn't going to cut it. We're involved in a situation where more people have their heads up their own asses, or worried about themselves. We're drawing inward at the very point when we should be thinking outward. So I don't know what the solution is. You are going to have to change the way people, we're going to have to change the way people think very rapidly. And apparently, as we've seen with COVID, this generation doesn't have what it takes, at least not to the degree that the World War II generation had. People just, I don't know if we could do it. We're going to have a rapid evolution in the way we think, in our perceptions, in our analysis of our place in the world and where we stand and what we're going to do. And we're going to have to do a 180 from this self-indulgence, self-centered selfishness that we have. And I don't know how we're going to do it, but that's what we've got to do. And right now, what I see is that from recent political and, shall we say, ultra legal, not extra legal, ultra legal, meaning Supreme Court decisions. We're moving in the opposite direction. We're like living in a bubble of hubris and denial, and that bubble's just going to collapse on us. So, and that cough right there is a perfect example. No, I don't know what we're going to do, but people are going to have to change their way of thinking very rapidly.
All right, thank you, Michael. Does everybody agree with Michael on his predictions? Does anybody differ?
Well, it's all very well to say that we're all wrapped up in our own narcissistic view of things, but we're not alone on this planet. There's China and there's India, and that's where the population really resides, and they're the ones that are going to change one way or the other. And to ask somebody who is on the upward, they're starting to ascend as far as standard of living, and then ask them to put a brake on it, so that Americans can live more comfortably in the future. That's a big ask, and you can advertise all you like and put out the propaganda about how the world's going to implode at some point, but when it comes to the practicality of getting on with your own life and succeeding such that you're not in poverty anymore, they're going to take coal-fired whatever. They're going to take oil-fired. They're going to take whatever it takes to get them out of that hole. And you can put sanctions on them, I suppose, for doing it at some future point. But then you're asking for trouble, because what right have you got to tell them that they're not entitled to what your entitlements are giving you? So it's a difficult argument, and unless it's up to science to come up with something that is cheaper, faster, better, and more sensible than coal and oil. That's a tough direction to hew into.
I have to apologize. I'm sorry,
Michael.
I have to apologize. I was using the United States as an example. It has to be a worldwide. The entire world has to change their way of thinking, and I see it as an uphill battle. But go on. Sorry.
All right. Does anybody else have any comments on this before we move on?
Yeah,
I've got
Darryl.
Go on, Darryl.
Go ahead, Darryl.
Oh, really quickly. There's a PBS special on flight, the airline industry in general, and it's an amazing special. And Frank is absolutely right. There are literally thousands of aircraft in the air all the time, which, on the other hand, would give you hope that there are some scientific changes. However, if we continue to pursue, if humans continue to pursue the carbon solution to their energy problems, I thoroughly agree with Michael. It's all over. What might be interesting is to take into context that people are always talking about saving the earth, saving the earth, saving the earth. Perhaps this is the way Mother Earth is ridding itself of the parasite that's no longer useful.
Yeah, that could be. All right, any other comments before we move on? Kenny or Dennis?
Yeah.
Go on, Ken.
Okay, go to McDonald's and get a strawberry float or something. Walk around the block, relax.
Go to McDonald's, huh?
What is your worst scenario? What is your worst case scenario for the next 50 years, excluding nuclear holocaust? Excluding that, if we don't have a nuclear holocaust, the temperature goes up 5 degrees. Well, the oceans come up and flood Los Angeles, New York City. All of Florida goes underwater. Okay. Right now, there's 8 billion people right now. and they're figuring it's going to peak out at 11 billion. And like some people are saying, maybe the industrialization or the gentrification of Africa and China will be the worst thing when, Chinese is a big consumer market now. And but the worst scenario is mankind has gotten through the Black Plague, which wiped out 2/3 of Europe. Mankind has gotten through the common cold that was brought to South America and wiped out 95% of the population in the Americas. And certain species have gone extinct. And let's say we go extinct and this civilization falls. Okay, I think there's been adequate evidence to show there were prior civilizations 12,000 years ago that were rather sophisticated, and some artifacts have been found from 20,000 years ago. And there's life in the rest of the universe. It's not to freak out. By the way, in case nobody's told you, everybody here in this group is going to pass away. We're not going to be here forever. You're going to go on.
What?
Okay?
Why wasn't I told?
You weren't told. That's right. And I've cleared it with a doctor. I said, "What about the warranty?" He says, "There's no warranty. You got arthritis. Live with it." So it's the same way that you can't get a renewal on the life, or maybe you can, but it's not going to be in the current body. So there's consequences that happen. The population of the United States has gone through a demographic inversion over the last 40 or 60 years since the Johnson change in the immigration law. And we're still here. It hasn't caused a collapse. There hasn't been another world war since 1945 for some goddamn reason. I don't know why. It seems everything so susceptible to a minor threshold of somebody making a stupid decision that could destroy continents or cause wars. And it hasn't really happened. It's happened with minor effects. And 20 million people here got killed, 20 million people there. You got Rwanda, things like that happen, like little explosions. You got tsunamis. Remember the tsunami wiped out, I don't know how many people, 500,000 people. Life is it's not written by a screenwriter in Hollywood. What happens, happens. Or with the human race, there are various people writing scripts for what they want to have happen, and they're not all in accord. To say that the whole world has to come to agreement in order to keep us alive, the best place I've seen where people never argue, they get along perfectly well, is out in California. If you come and visit Forest Lawn Cemetery, at that point, people now can live with each other now that they're dead. Other than that, there's conflict. And everybody's got this initiative of, I have a better idea. I think we should do this. I think we should do that. There's chaos in any system, not just human beings. Take a look at your garden. There's a struggle going on between the petunias and the weeds and the roses and the camellias. They're all fighting for survival. They're not singing a song like a Disney movie. So these are the consequences of the world we live in because we're alive. And don't come up with a stupid solution like everybody has to hold their breath for 3 seconds, or something like that. Or everybody has to stop wearing shoes made out of leather. Everybody has to stop cleaning their nails because it's polluting the society. You're not going to get that kind of consistency with 8 billion people spread across a planet which doesn't have everybody linked in to an automatic control system. And it doesn't matter what you make legal or illegal. It doesn't mean people are going to stop doing what you think is illegal because you said it's illegal.
This is the result of a survey done in California that half of Americans expect a second civil war within years. More than 40% of Americans surveyed believe in the Great Replacement theory. In other words, white folk are disappearing. And that's the justification, as we know, for some of these mass shootings going on. And nearly a fifth expect that they will choose to bring a gun to a violent political role. And this poll is done by the University of California at Davis, and it was just published a few days ago. But Frank, jump in with what you were going to say.
Okay, I was just saying it's a little bit too fatalistic. I mean, we don't sit around. If we cut ourselves, we don't bleed out. We actually take steps to stop that. I mean, it's just, there is a reaction. There is a normal action, a survival reaction that is part of life. We all want to survive, and so to accept the inevitable sooner than necessary makes no sense. But you know, that's your philosophy, which is suggests that it's been just pure luck that we haven't had wars. It's not the fact that we spent $500 billion and then up to about nearly $1 trillion on defense every year. We did that to stop actual wars from going to the global World War III. That's real. That is a real argument, and to say that there's an industrial complex making all this kind of money out of it is true. Nevertheless, we didn't have that war, and we're not in the situation of, say, Ukraine or Yemen or any of the other places that have faced wars. That's the beauty of living in the United States. That's why we got refugees coming through here all the time, by the hundreds of thousands, as you're correct about that. So that's an offshoot of the fact that we spend so much on defense. This is a nice place to live relative to everywhere else. Now, we can make it better. And again, there's nothing wrong with innovation. There's nothing wrong with science coming up with solutions to these dire warnings that are coming down the pipe. Like I mentioned, London was almost uninhabitable until they came up with smokeless coal. And then it didn't happen overnight either. It took a long time. You still get pea soupers. I remember them. So that's just the way it is. But whether we do it in time, generally speaking, we've done that. We've made decisions just in the nick of time. Although you're right about the Black Plague and other plagues like it, we perhaps weren't able to put science to work at that point. But I think science is ahead of the curve. But you've got to give it its leeway. You've got to give it the money to make that happen, and you've got to accept that that's part of it. And it's a sacrifice, but that's enough.
All right. Oh, we're joined by a doggy. Okay. Anyway, one of the things I wanted to interject was many years ago when I was doing a television show, I remember I put on the air the person from NASA who had been suppressed because he was talking about global climate change a long time ago and he was suppressed. But I want to direct us to this issue of, do you guys think, or do you feel that we're close to a civil war? And this discussion of 40% favor a strong leader over democracy and adhere to the immigrant takeover belief, the Great Replacement Theory. 1/5 expect to be gun-toting at a January 6th Capitol riot melee in the coming years. And the university researchers concluded that their findings exceeded our worst expectations. And we have, of course, Mr. Trump running around, stop the steal. We look at these different primaries going on around the country where, Pence, I believe, has showed up occasionally and to reinforce a non-Trump candidate. I think he really did that in Indiana just recently. But then, of course, you have Trump probably going to announce to run for president again. So what do people think? Are we on the verge of a civil war or not? Or are we already in a civil war? I think we're frankly in a civil war. I think we've been in a civil war since the 60s, but that's my opinion. But what do others say? Okay, Frank, go on.
Okay, this is the difficult subject, and had the opportunity to debate it with the guys at the diner. There are demographic changes. Now, the way I see it is, in the United States, you've got 3 different parallel groups that that have histories that don't necessarily want to intertwine. And as we've pointed out, this idea of assimilation and melting pot is an illusion that is quite clearly primarily in the white community. Okay, there is some crossover, but essentially the Black community and the Hispanic community, which is growing increasingly, don't see the same trajectory in terms of culture as the white community. So, you know, what whites perceive as their history is, you know, they see it as American history. And of course, that is not gelling with that of the Hispanic or the Black community. So when you tout the idea of assimilation, how can you do that? When, as I said, asked somebody who was a friend of mine, and I said, he was Black, I said to him, you know, well, somebody's got to fill the shoes of the white people if you're going to, you know, if there's going to be a demographic change. Well, that, you know, he went apoplectic practically, because why should a Black person fill the shoes of a white person? It's like, they're totally different parallel universes almost. So that's a problem. Back in the day, of course, you know, Hollywood was an instrument that made or pretended that there was a possibility of assimilation. Now, as you had the salt and pepper sort of, you know, teens, and it wasn't necessarily, you know, a white guy always being a dominant guy, but, you know, you also had Eddie Murphy with Nick Nolte, and it was clearly Eddie Murphy wasn't the dominant guy, but it didn't work. Hollywood didn't work. Netflix doesn't work that way either, or doesn't seem to. So each group, you've got Spanish television, obviously, that's a of its on its own vector, and you know, the concept of what is it to be, what is an American citizen? What is he? What is the model? Who is the, you know, who should we look back to? Gary Cooper, you know, John Wayne, Donald Trump, right? Is that the model of an American? And are they all the same? Is it just, you know, the Clint Eastwood character? Or is it somebody else? Who do we look to? And do we look to a guy? Clearly, you've got women in the mix too who don't want to see themselves as straitjacketed by that past. And then again, there's those who want to dispense with the past and completely and just pretend it never happened. There's one huge monumental mistake. So this is not good. This is not good from a country's point of view. If you want to see a nation state as important, if you don't want to even see that, you want to just look at global terms. It's like, this is just an address space. I live in New York. It's in, it's in the United States, which is, who cares? You know, should you see yourself as something to be proud of? Or, you know, rather, your country to be proud of, you know, my country, right or wrong kind of mentality. These are issues. And, you know, obviously, critical race theory is from you know, many white people's point of view, it's an attack on the past. You know, the founding fathers are a bunch of racists, and whatever they said was worthless. And there's issues there.
All right.
So where do you start? I mean, just let me finish. There is a reality of demographic change. There is a reality, and it has to be, somebody has to take charge. And who's going to take charge? That is the issue that worries a lot of people. If you're not following a certain track from their perspective, then what happens? What do we end up with? Do we end up as Cuba or what?
All right. Let me differ with you. Who has that dog in the background? Anyway, all right. Let me differ with you. First of all, I consider Malcolm X an American. I consider Muhammad Ali an American. I consider Stokely Carmichael an American. They're products of the United States. Do I think that they differ in terms of identifying with sort of a xenophobic version of America? Of course they differ. But I do think that these people are brought and breed out of the melting pot of the American culture, number one. Number two, the issue of assimilation. Yeah, we could go back to criticizing that play by the famous play, The Melting Pot, done before the First World War, during the First World War, where we get that terminology. And that was basically, if I recall, Michael can correct me, a Jew marrying a Gentile, is that part of what that play was all about? But the melting pot, yeah, is what? And the melting pot, is not an illusion. Many Americans, ethnically, depending on their, cultural ethnic identification, not talking about different categories of white males. Because white males, you see the statistics are a little different. But many Americans, Hispanic Americans, African Americans, they do identify and self-identify themselves as American. Frederick Douglass, in his arguments with those who wanted to, like Martin Delany, when he wanted to go set up colonies in Africa, he said, we're here and we're not going anywhere. We're here in America. Now, finally, the issue of critical race theory to me is a bullshit, phony issue. Americans, I've read the critical race theory tracks, decades ago, back in the 80s when they were starting to produce them. Okay, it's an interesting perspective, sort of an offshoot of critical legal theory and dealing with the question of racism. There's good things and bad things about it. But nevertheless, what we're having right now is a epiphany after, one, the 1619 Project, which this show has debated, became a sort of bellwether issue to discuss the question of slavery. Does America begin in 1619 when the first slaves are being sold in Jamestown as a result of a privateer, an English privateer, seizing a Spanish load of slaves and then deciding to come to Jamestown? Or does it occur differently? And then the murder of George Floyd exploited everything around the country. So now people are conscious of slavery, which frankly, I thought, erroneously of course, that these issues had been settled in the 60s. Obviously they weren't. So to sit there and separate out slavery as distinct from American history is absolutely ridiculous, because it's integral to how the United States forms. Now, if we get to the point of the rejection of the founders of the Constitution, yeah, they all were people who in varying degrees defended slavery. They wrote off, as you know, the compromise was to allow the South to have more slaves identified as, lesser entities in their way they divided up the demography. So yes, one could say without hesitation that from the point of view of a modern perspective, they were indeed racist and white supremacists. On the other hand, the ideas they argued are on them themselves worthy of contemplation. There's contradictions in how we identify as Americans and how we assimilate these things. I've been watching this fight go on for 60 years, when the breakdown starts in the 60s, and it's never been resolved. I think we can agree on that. But let me bring other people in. Other people have comments about this?
Yeah, actually,
Michael.
If I can chime in. First of all, I agree with you, Jim, that I don't know if it goes back to the 60s, but we're in the middle of a form of a civil war. We're not going to have a civil war as we did in the 1860s with opposing armies. I mean, that's just not going to work right now. Nobody's going to come up with an army that's going to be able to take on the United States military, including the Air Force, the Navy. Forget it. Okay.
Michael, I agree with that, but then look at what's going on with this January 6th insurrection.
No. What I'm trying to say is what we're having is a different kind of civil war, and that's what we're going to have, which is basically something that's going to split the country, not necessarily in two, but into many different pieces. It's just going to fracture and split apart in the country into different pieces. But it's going to be more like what happened on January 6th, but with hundreds of January 6th. We're going to be basically the fabric of the country is going to fall apart. That's the kind of civil war. You might call it a civil insurrection, or insurrection, on steroids gone haywire. But I think, yes, we are headed for that. I think you said about 30% of the country believes in a strong leader rather than democracy, which means 30% of the country is anti-American. And that's the 30% that claims they're the most American of all. So we've also got that, that people, that part of the population that's totally separated from reality, and totally hypocritical. I mean, blatantly hypocritical. And again, they basically have the heads up their own asses. But the fact is that, we do have a big problem here. I agree that, to me, the quintessential American when I was a kid was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. That was, to me, what America was supposed to be. But the problem is, the thing about the United States is we're not supposed to be represented by a person or a personality type or anything like that. I mean, yeah, we have Hollywood, but if we're gonna base our survival and our concept of Americanism on Hollywood, we might as well sign the epitaph, fill out the epitaph for America right now. Forget Hollywood, okay, and forget those. I mean, you can't get more superficial than that for the most part. And even if we go to political leaders, the United States, the identity of the United States is based on ideas or concepts. And that is very difficult for people who have, let's say, who are intellectually challenged, let's say, to wrap their heads around. I mean, in other words, they want to see a face. They want to see something. They, when they think of God, they want to think of a picture, a human, a picture of a human. They don't, conceptual abstract ideas are very difficult for people to wrap themselves around. But that's basically what America needs people to do. That is what America is about. And if we look at, for instance, the United Kingdom or Great Britain, and we look at, I mean, in other words, they have had a very, very checkered past, but they deal with it. They don't deny it. They deal with it. It is part of their history. And therefore, they see them, in other words, they survived. The British Empire hasn't survived except as an empire of ideas. But they've survived. Great Britain has survived by including all the negative, the checkered, the bad parts of their history as part of their history. And they see it as a growing concern, as an evolving concern. And that's why how we have to see the United States. In other words, I mean, slavery was part of the United States, whether we like it or not. The United States has a lot to answer for. How it treated First Nations people or Native Americans here. Come on, I mean, can you get more, shall we say, demographically American or ethnically American than Native Americans? But the fact is, the way we treated them is another horrific episode in our history. I mean, we've had all types of racism, anti-Semitism, and anti-Catholicism, and that, if we don't see the United States as something that is evolving towards the ideal of the concept that it was created on, that it was created for, then we don't have a country anyway. Then we are going to be, continue on towards this path of civil war or a massive civil insurrection that will split the country apart. We're not a race-based country. We're not a demographically based country. And people who believe this don't believe in America. I'm sorry. If you believe in America, you have to believe in the concept of it. And therefore, if they can't do that, we can't have a country. We've managed to do it for all these years, for a couple of hundred years, But if people can't wrap their heads around it anymore, then maybe, as Franklin said, we can't, or to paraphrase him, we can't keep it.
All right. All right. Others have comments on this issue. Anybody? Kenny, Dennis, Darryl?
First of all, I think that you all need to get up to date with your language. The term slavery has been replaced by forced involuntary relocation. So it's called forced involuntary relocation, and having perhaps descended from one who was forced involuntary relocated, I'm trying to understand what folks are talking about in the context that since about 1876, when the South finally triumphed in the Civil War, what has this experiment provided for people who come here and when they fail to fit in, or their labor is no longer worthy of exploitation, how does that work out? So what I'm experiencing like right now is, okay, what is the total population of the United States? My understanding was the 2020 census, 66% of European descent. When you look at the Congress, when you look at the Senate, when you look at the executive, what's the problem? If as John Kane said, who is an indigenous, oh, he doesn't like that term, who has people who were born on this land, they're down to like 1%. We have no say here. It may look like a say, you can pretend it's a say, but when push comes to shove, to be totally crude, this is white folks' business. If you don't have a job, it's not because some Black Lives Matter person is protesting downtown. Yet if you look at, go to YouTube, or what's the gentleman's name? I think his name is Egilberto Wills. He does a program called, can't do that right now. W. Kamal Bell has a program on, and he asked people, what was CRT? And it's hilarious what the answers are. It's hilarious to listen to. It's very unhilarious to experience. So bottom line is, what I want as quote unquote an American, and I also contend that if you have to keep passing laws in order to substantiate your citizenship, you're not a citizen. So what I would like out of this is teach history. What happened? When did it happen? Who were involved in the happenings? And what was the outcome? Could we just decide to do that and leave the emotion out of it?
All right. Any other comments? Dennis or Ken? Dennis? You can unmute Dennis if you'd like.
Yeah.
Go on, Dennis.
I think like you, Jim, we've been in the Civil War since at least the 60s. And we have at least 50% of the population at the end of the Vietnam War was still in favor of our fighting in war. And we had as many as 500,000 to 1 million people in Washington, D.C. twice a year for several years against the war. And still 50% of the country was for the war at the end of the war. And that's typical. It's like if you check out the first Civil War in 1861 to 65, we're fighting it. We're still fighting it. The South is still fighting the war, the Civil War, the first Civil War. which is morphing into the second civil war, which could be eventually a third civil war. This is a country with a lot of dogmatic individualists who are not democratic at all, and we're in deep trouble. We're in deep trouble from global warming. The possibility of a nuclear war is still with us, and we have a oligarchy that thinks it should rule the world when the rest of the world is against that. So we've got a lot of contradictions that need to be resolved. And if they're not resolved, we might end up losing our habitat. And that's the Earth. And I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you, Dennis. Kenny, do you have any comments about this issue?
No.
Are we on the verge of a civil war?
Oh, I think that's a canard. I think that somebody's pushing an agenda that the countries are at each other's throats. There's nothing, and people do not have anything in common with each other. The world has a lot in common with each other. When you travel, you'll see that they have cars on roads. Oh, well, I don't know. I think in Italy or maybe some places in France, they really don't have any traffic laws. But most often cars, go either on the right side or the left side. There's consistency. In America, almost everybody there is a conflict between an iPhone and an Android. But everybody's got a cell phone, and everybody eats, and everybody buys clothes, and everybody goes to the beach, and everybody watches TV. Everybody knows what Netflix is. Most everybody speaks English, except for a few diehards. And they understand the concept of school. They understand sports and supporting a team. They understand sex and concept of procreation, even if they don't understand or have a divergent view on what a proper family is. They understand that procreation creates more of the species. So there's a lot of things that people agree on. There's a lot of points of agreement. And people should not, I think it's a detrimental thing to point out that those people who don't agree with your idealistic concepts of what kind of a utopia we should be striving for are idiots or deficient mentally, or they're vile, or they have negative attitudes. And my viewpoint is, and I'm not going to make a declaration that I want to educate you, but there's a little bit of everything in everybody. There's a little bit of vengeance and stubbornness and wanting to go on a rant and wanting to get even and wanting to get more than your share. You want more than you deserve, and wanting to cheat and wanting to get around the system and wanting to get away with things, and wanting to be left alone and wanting to be made famous. There's a little bit of all the human characteristics in all of us, but it varies in degrees in each individual. So to vilify somebody because they don't agree with a particular ideology or religious belief, and when I say religious, there's materialism is a religion, communism is a religion, science is a religion. The Big Bang, there was nothing, and then there the universe appeared. It's the most religious religion I've seen. And that's the law. And if you don't believe that, you're really irreligious. You're a heretic if you don't believe in the Big Bang theory. So somebody wants to think that the world is broken up into two characteristics, them and us. And there's nothing in between. It's them or us. Whose side are you on? That's to create that concept. As everybody gives credit. That's the way. I think it was Kissinger who said, "That's the best thing is to get the Iraqis fighting the Iranians, promote conflict in the tribes." That's what the British did when they would conquer new territories, they'd get the Indian tribes to fight with each other. That's the way they could take advantage of it. And so, breeding contempt or conflict between people is a negative thing. And instead, you should see that in others which you can agree with, or that in others which is positive or beneficial, and even if it's bad, if you can at least try to see from the viewpoint of that person why they don't think what they're doing is bad. They think what they're doing is good. Okay? And I think there's an argument to be made that said human beings and most species do what they think is the correct thing to do. They don't do the incorrect thing. And the only fallacy where you can argue that is if you guys see him hitting himself in the head with a hammer. He thinks it's the right thing. He deserves to be punished. That's the right thing to do. That's why he's suffering or sacrificing himself. He's trying to do the right thing. And that's what all organisms do. They want to survive. They try to do what's most correct, even if it's killing and maiming or destroying or anything. But in any event, it's bad for the promotion of the idea that there's two factions or multiple factions. You have to be cautious and afraid of everybody. It's a bad idea. Now, you don't have to promote it. That's there anyhow, because everybody's into that. So it's not something you want to promote and say, oh, there's a civil war. Yeah, there's been a cultural war going on since the 1960s, whichever side of it you're on. And there's a conflict, because conflict is part of society. Competition, not cooperative. There's also collaboration and cooperation, but there's always competition. Competition has a benefit of getting the best up to the top to provide the most service to the rest of society by what they can contribute. Then blah, blah, blah. I'm talking on and on. I don't think there's a civil war. I don't think there's going to be a civil war. But in the regards of like a definitive civil war, is there a war going on between those who want police and those who want to defund the police? Yeah, there's a political war. There's a PR war. There's gunfire war. There's a war going on between the Crips and the Bloods. There's a war going on between Ukraine and Russia. There's a war going on. There's commercial wars in commerce and wars between gangs and wars in a home, domestic disputes. So it's there, but it's part of the human experience. It's part of the human scene. It will never be eliminated. There will always be some degree of conflict, except, as I said, for the residents of Forest Lawn.
All right, thank you. Frank, you wanted to add your comments to this? Frank?
Yeah. That's a very pleasant sermon that Ken just gave. And from any pulpit, I would love to hear that if I was a church-going kind of guy, but I'm not. And yes, it's an outcome that basically says, whatever que sera, sera. And I think that's a charming way of looking at things. But fact is, there are narratives that are essential to a nation that have to be hammered out. And clearly there has been an absence of certain key ingredients to that narrative that have misrepresented the past. That's clear. But by putting them in a certain way, you are, without question, altering a perception of the past, and it also makes it more difficult to put across to young people. And in a sense, it makes it more difficult because there are many tributaries to a river of a narrative. And if you start dividing it up into many different lanes or tributaries, you come up with something that is not compelling. And yes, Hollywood matters. And yes, it cannot be an abstract concept. It can't be, because people aren't that way. Even the most academic people still identify with people, with yes, pictures of people. They still necessarily do. So unfortunately, you do have to have a narrative that is inclusive, but nevertheless, it has some individuals in the past that are worthy of emulation. Okay. And if the counter arguments to whether or not they're worth emulating are such that they destroy the narrative itself and break it up into a myriad pieces, that does damage. That does damage to the future because it does damage to what young people understand as being what it is to be an American. And that actually does matter. It's not good enough to say, well, the que sera, sera, or, we need reparations for the past damages done to us. And by the way, it's all their fault because, there's going to be a counterploy, a counteraction, counterweight to that. And that is going to be, and is, in fact, there. It does not augur well for a future understanding of what it is to be an American. And you do not want a civil war. Nobody wants a civil war. So there has to be, as you would say, accommodation, reconciliation, what have you. But there's got to be a realistic understanding that, some of what was done in the past was reprehensible, yeah, but the vast majority of it was good. Why? Because what this is now is better than anybody else's place. It's better than any other place on the planet. And that needs to be, I think, somehow emphasized much more than it is. And, you can say that there are moments in the past that deflected it from being the greatest nation, but that was solved. It was solved by an American Civil War. And you say, oh my God, no, there was what followed was a travesty, and it undid all that the Civil War did. No, it didn't. It did not. It can't have. It still went on a trajectory that was pretty flat, but it nevertheless it ascended. And we are where we are today, and we're better than we have been. But again, if you want to tear it down, there are too many opportunities to do it. So that is, this is a fundamental problem for education to look at. And unfortunately, we've got to be the best we can. And the only way we can do that is by educating people. And if there is a counter, if people, young people in particular, reject the whole education system because it doesn't suit them, that's a mistake. That will lead to civil war. So
All right.
That's my 2 cents.
All right. Let me just interject. And again, who's a doggy? Please, doggy.
Jim, I did want to make a comment.
No, hold on. I want to show. I'm showing something here. I don't know where I'll let you in a second there, Michael.
Okay.
Iconoclasm happens after every upheaval. Now, I'm showing you a picture of of Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia. And that you can see the statue of Robert E. Lee and all the different symbolisms and demonstrations in front of it. Here again is that picture of Robert E. Lee down on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia. This is the picture of Mr. Goldstein in Bristol, who was a beneficiary of the slave trade, was supposedly involved in purchasing and selling about 75,000 human beings. And this is the statue of the person who has been put into his place. Remember, we have the famous scene in Bristol after the explosion of the reaction globally to George Floyd's murder of Mr. Goldstein being dumped into the river. Then we have, of course, attacks in England on Winston Churchill. Again, a iconic figure of the 20th century in British history, and who indeed is on record making all kind of comments that would reinforce the message of this particular part of his statue here in London. Churchill was a racist. There's absolutely no doubt he was. And then you have, of course, in Belgium, you have King Leopold being defaced, and we know King Leopold was involved in the atrocious atrocities that frankly accelerated and created the first manifestations after the Civil War of a human rights movement internationally. That is what happened in the Belgian Congo. And then we have here Christopher Columbus, who was bitten to dust in New Mexico, along with a statue of Christopher Columbus elsewhere in the United States, quote, defaced. And of course, Christopher Columbus is chosen as a target because at the third voyage, or second and third voyage, he begins to not only accelerate and start a conscious policy of enslaving the Taino population, but then decides, because he's taking advantage of the well-established slave trade that existed in that period of time in the late 15th century, throughout the entire globe, I might add, including Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. He tapped into the need to export black slaves from Africa in order to, quote, develop Hispaniola. And here, of course, is again a picture of, this is down in, there's Jefferson Davis being removed in, oh no, that I don't think that's Jefferson Davis. That could be Stonewall Jackson being removed down in Richmond. So, and again, those are people who I grew up with as having great admiration for as military commanders. I still respect them as military commanders, but I never ever doubted for a minute that they were defending slavery and using their brilliance as combat leaders to defend slavery. But Michael, go on, jump in.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to make a couple of points. One of them is, Ken, you actually made, you get the award for the most unintentionally absurd remark of the night, I believe, which is that when you said science is a religion. No, in science, something does not become a fact until it's proven, actually. Religion is based on belief. Once things are proven in religion, then religion loses its reason for being. So that's one thing. But that was, I know you were trying to make another point, so I just thought it was amusing. To address what Frank was saying, is that about the United States, Hollywood mattering and everything like that. Does it matters, but it shouldn't matter. That's the entire point. If we keep on saying America is going to have to be, we're going to have to pull it down so that the lowest common denominator can wrap its head around it, then we don't have the United States of America as it was designed to be. We have to try to get people to lift themselves up, or help them lift themselves up conceptually to the point where they can rise to that level. And I'll go a step further and I'll say that as long as racism is a going concern in this country will never be what it's supposed to be. You cannot cater. You cannot just say, well, this is the way people are, so we're going to have to, just cave into that. Then you don't have the United States of America. You don't have the United States. You have a country, but it won't be the country that it was designed to be. It'll be a country like every other country, and probably not a democracy, and probably not a republic. This country is held together by those ideas. It is not held together by demographics or race, or it shouldn't be. That one race, in other words, this idea of white guys, or this concept of a white person being the person that we should all aspire to be. That's not what's supposed to hold this country together. This country, in order to exist, will have to at least aspire to wrap itself around that idea, to aspire to be able to believe that the glue that holds us together are these great ideas or great concepts. And the only thing I would rather quote a play than a film, but if I quote or paraphrase from Arthur Miller's play, All My Sons, when the father, who has been revealed to have sold dysfunction, basically non-functional parts to the military that resulted in the death of 21 airmen. And he basically tries to defend himself to his son by saying, well, look, I had a business, I had to support a family. What else could I do? What else could I be? And the son says, you can be better. And if we don't aspire to be better and don't aspire to improve ourselves and don't aspire to make this country what it's supposed to be, what it should be from the concept of it, then yeah, it may not even matter if we have a civil war. The country won't matter at all.
All right. Well, I guess, go on, Darryl.
I ask your forgiveness for belaboring the point, but I've got a couple of questions to ask. Does the United States of America have any political prisoners? Has anyone experienced being in this country without phenotypical white skin privilege? I remember watching, once again, one of those movies, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, in which it was done in Florida, and there was a family of European descent who were starving, literally starving. The father was out catching alligators because he wasn't able to get a job, and he wasn't very successful at that either. There was an African-American woman who owned her home, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. She offered to allow the woman of European descent to do her laundry. That man beat his wife almost to death because I don't care what's happening, you ain't no nigga. That was it. Now, today, right now, if you are a person of African descent, person of Latino descent, I'm going to shy away from Asian because I've been learning things about that community that are beyond shocking. There is even, let me go back. The Cherokee. The Cherokee were the example of the ultimate when it came to melting pot theory. They dressed like Europeans. They modeled their businesses after Europeans. They bought slaves like Europeans. But when push came to shove, the Europeans sent them to Oklahoma, Indian Territory, Oklahoma Territory. So this whole thing about melting pot and trying to model yourself after whoever came before you, not so much. And once again, if you stay with history, when did certain ethnic groups become white? So you want to study that so that you understand it more clearly. Because everyone, when they came here, wasn't accorded the same privileges. And about the founding fathers, why don't we teach the history? How many white people could vote after the Constitution was founded? So just to sum this up, if anybody is unaware, Matula Shakur, who's he's a year younger than I am, who's 72 years old, has been in I believe, a federal max prison for somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 years. He was a brilliant acupuncturist. He was arrested and charged with conspiracy to prevent the flight of a federal prisoner, has spent that time in jail, and is now with terminal bone cancer and dementia, and they still won't let him out. He's only one of maybe 200-300. Russell Maroon Schultz, who spent 49 years in prison, dead in prison. So
All right. Thank you, Darryl. I want to thank everybody tonight. We had a spirited debate. I want to thank Ken Aaron, of course, in California, Dennis Goldstein, Darryl McPherson, Michael Jankowitz, and Frank Radford. I'm glad we talked about these kind of issues, because these are issues that are pressing and are real to face in our society. This was the July 20th show of Going Viral at goingviral.net. Or is it we're still at .net, Ken, or GV Combine? What is it, gvcombine.org on YouTube?
No, it's GV Combine in YouTube.
I want to thank everybody tonight for their help and participation, and have a pleasant evening. Good night.